Welcome to the Global News podcast on YouTube, where we go behind the headlines to find out more about a story and why it matters. Today, as President Donald Trump doubles down on his territorial ambitions for Greenland, European leaders have united to declare firmly that the territory is out of bounds. France, Germany, Britain and others have said that Greenland belongs to its people and that only Denmark and Greenland themselves can decide what happens to it. But will a united European front be enough to warn off President Trump? We're joined now by our correspondent James Waterhouse, who is in Paris for us. James, let's start off with this statement from European leaders. Why are they making this now?
They seem to have felt the need to put this statement out because of Donald Trump's repeated claims of wanting to annex Greenland. We are seeing an increasing number of senior White House figures refusing to rule out taking the Danish-controlled territory by force. And so we have this highly unusual, to put it mildly, scenario where you've got the ambitions of NATO's most powerful member making the rest of the alliance nervous. And, Mette Frederiksen, the Danish Prime Minister, she said, look, if enough is enough, and if America does try and do such a thing, then the NATO alliance would be dead. And we have to remind ourselves, this gathering today is about discussing concrete military promises for Ukraine. What Europe's hoping to do is win over America to say, look, we'll stump up what we can militarily. Please help us in case we do end up in direct confrontation with Russia. And yet the dialogue now, the discourse, is being dominated by the imperial ambitions of not just Russia, but America as well.
James, it's interesting. You're talking to us in Paris, where European leaders had gathered to talk about Ukraine, but clearly the escalating rhetoric from President Trump's administration may be hijacking the agenda somewhat.
It's hard to know what the motives are, but I think if you're seeing European leaders put out a statement where they say it is up for the people of Greenland and Denmark to decide what relations Greenmark was to build, then the problem there is that clearly they see the situation as being urgent enough for them to have to respond. In the build-up to this, when we've been putting in questions and trying to find out about the details of this summit and the agenda, the organisers are very keen to keep it about Ukraine and what help the Ukrainian military are going to get in the long term. And yet, by putting out this statement, that is now impossible. They have to acknowledge that America and its claims of wanting to annex Denmark now carry, frankly, more weight after the extraordinary US intervention we've seen in Venezuela. And I think what Venezuela also reminds us of is the military might of America. We talk about it a lot with the context of Ukraine and what it can provide. But when you look at the operation that was performed in Venezuela, that is what Europe wants to see more of here. They want such a capability, such a backstop as they prepare to face Russian aggression in the long term.
James, we've heard from the German foreign minister today saying that no matter what, Greenland would come under NATO's Article 5 security guarantee. What do we know about how NATO could possibly defend itself from its, as you say, its most powerful, important founding member?
It couldn't. I think, that idea of collective defence against America, if a NATO member was to be annexed in such a way, is something that could not be countered militarily. And that is reflected by this diplomatic roadshow we continue to see ourselves in. The European Union, for example, has pledged to spend trillions of euros over the next decade or two to increase its defence spending, to increase domestic ammunition production, weaponry, armoured vehicles and the like. But it still acknowledges that it needs America's intelligence, its air superiority and the scale and quality of what it can provide. It can't match the US, and that is a product of a post-World War era. And so, in practice, if America was to do the extraordinary thing of grabbing Greenland by force, an ally, then there's very little Europe could do about it. to be frank. And also, Denmark is an ally of America as things stand. It's in the NATO alliance. If America wanted to increase its military presence there on the territory significantly, it's hard to imagine Copenhagen not going for that. And so, I think the argument here is one of principle. And I think actually, whilst Europe wouldn't be able to respond militarily, it would mark the end of the alliance and the trust in it. And, what do you think Russia would make of that? I don't think the Kremlin could believe its luck, seeing how the West is fracturing over the original question of how to support Ukraine, the country it's still invading.
James, speaking of Russia, Trump has said several times that Greenland is obviously very strategic in its strategic Arctic zone, which there is stiff competition between the US and Russia and China. This rapidly deteriorating relationship between America and its allies in Europe, surely that is not in its long-term interest if it wants to see off competition from Russia and China.
It's hard to kind of read the motives beyond its kind of the military advantages of Greenland. I mean, clearly, yes, there is competition. There are security concerns on the North Pole. There have been for a very long time among the NATO alliance. But I think for European leaders, what's most concerning is how America has been so ready to engage with Russia directly. And if you take that in conjunction with what we've seen in South America, and Donald Trump deciding that he is indeed an interventionist on the Western Hemisphere where it suits him, that amounts, I think, to a carving up that makes Europe feel increasingly uncomfortable. So I think for America, this is looking about influence, immediate influence. Donald Trump is making that increasingly clear. And if the NATO alliance and certainly his relationship with Europe is collateral damage, perhaps for the White House it's acceptable collateral damage. I mean, a lot can happen behind the closed doors of the Elysee Palace, but this is not a start many would have predicted, where you have European leaders having to put out a joint statement in a collective support of a European country and its territorial sovereignty in the face of, I'm not going to say aggression, but certainly assertive statements from one of its own.
James, for many years now, nations around the world have tried to tell the difference between Trumpian bluster and words that lead to actions. And let's say if President Trump makes good on his threats to move forward on his territorial ambitions for Greenland, the consequences could be punitive for America. The EU is a very important trading ally. The US sends a lot of arms and military equipment to Europe. Do you get a sense that the Trump administration has perhaps passed the risks of alienating its allies in this way?
I don't think we're there yet because, Europe is still the relative minnow. I mean, you're right, it's an economic powerhouse. It could make America feel pain with access to markets. It could affect the strength of the dollar, for example. But we're talking about security. Now, you're seeing, for example, Sir Keir Starmer, the UK Prime Minister, he's walking up with Emmanuel Macron smiling. There is senior representation from the US here with Steve Witkoff, the senior envoy, and Jared Kushner, Donald Trump's son-in-law. And, the question for Europe now is for how much longer can they carry on with charm? There is too much at stake for them to completely abandon on that strategy. But there will be growing calls, certainly, not least from Denmark. If Greenland looks increasingly perilous, there will be increasing calls for that, for a shift in strategy to go from charm to more condemnation. And I think, in the past with Donald Trump and that brinkmanship you talk about, it has produced increased defence spending in Europe. The continent is seemingly trying to do what it can. But with Greenland, it's hard to see what it is trying to leverage, given that Denmark is an ally. And so I think that is a worrying uncertainty, and it is why European leaders have said, Mr. President, enough.
All right, thanks, James. That's our correspondent in Paris, James Waterhouse. You can hear more of this story on the Global News podcast. You can find that wherever you listen to your podcasts. If you liked this episode, do subscribe to us here on YouTube. And if you'd like us to cover any more stories, do let us know in the comments below. Thanks for watching.